morning and welcome everyone online. I think you can see us well and hear us well. Otherwise, just raise your hand and tell us if something is going wrong with the technology. It is really my pleasure to chair this event here today. This book presentation and discussion around the last book of Professor Markus Thiel titled The European Union International Promotion of LGBTI Rights, Promises and Pitfalls. I got lost into my ideas and my reflections. We will have the book. I will briefly, just very quickly tell you how we have conceived a bit this session here today. So we will have first the 30-40 minute presentation of the book by Professor Thiel, followed by a discussion by Professor Paternotte, and then we will open the floor for like a conversation with the audience and basically a Q&A, so we can exchange on the book altogether. Before introducing our two speakers, I would also briefly introduce myself so that you know who's speaking to you at the moment. So my name is Serena D'Agostino. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, the VUB. And I'm currently a visiting fellow here at the Université Brussels under the guidance of Professor Jacquot and under the framework of the EUGENDERING Monnet chair. Professor Jacquot will tell us a bit more about this in a minute. So I will now give the floor to Professor Jacquot for some institutional greetings and then briefly introduce the speakers, and then we can start with our presentation. Please, Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Serena. I just want to take just a few seconds of your time. I wanted to thank everyone again, Serena and David, and of course Markus, and we are very pleased to welcome and host Markus for a few days in the framework of the Jean Monnet chair here. And also I just wanted to underline that I'm really happy that we are here able to put together this event, joining the forces of all the Brussels-based universities. So you are in Université Saint-Louis Brussels. David is representing the ULB and Serena the VUB. So I think it's quite nice and something that we could do more. And it was just something worth mentioning, I thought. And so thank you very much again, and I just give you back the floor.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you. So I'm now briefly introducing our two speakers. I will start from the author of the book that we are going to listen to soon. Professor Markus Thiel is professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University, Miami, and director of the Florida International University's Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. His research interests are the political sociology of the European Union and the European politics more broadly, as well as identity politics. He has published abundantly on these topics. I will only mention a few of his works because the list would be too long. For instance, among his monographies, I would like to mention EU Civil Society and Human Rights Advocacy of 2017. And among the long list of co-edited volumes, Diversity and European Union, 2009, Identity Politics in the Age of Globalization from 2010, European Identity and Culture, Narratives of Transnational Belonging, 2012, and many more, including the book we are discussing here today, from 2021, and also another one in publication about the politics of social inclusion and exclusion in the EU. So the list is very long, and I will stop here, not to take too long. It's a big honor to have you here and to share this moment with you. It's also a big honor to have our discussant, Professor David Paternotte, here with us. Professor David Paternotte is Professor of Sociology at the Université libre de Bruxelles, ULB, where he is also the co-director of the Structure de recherche interdisciplinaire sur le genre, and also the Vice Dean of International Relations at the Faculty of Philosophy and Social Sciences. Again, the list is getting quite long. And he's also the director of the Inter-University Master in Gender Studies that brings together the 6 universities of the Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles. So, with Sophie, indeed. His research interests focus on gender, sexuality, and social movements mainly. And again, I will only mention a few research works and publications, such as the monograph Revendiquer le mariage gay, Belgique, France, Espagne, 2011. Co-edited volumes such as the Lesbian and Gay Movement and the State, also from 2011. LGBT activism and the making of Europe, a rainbow Europe, ? With Philippe Ayub, 2014. Anti-gender campaigns, mobilizing against equality, 2017, etc., etc., etc. So thank you very much, David, for accepting our invitation and being here with us today. I will stop here so that we can start with a substantial part of our event. So I will give the floor now to Markus for the presentation, and then we will give the floor to David for the discussion afterwards. So the floor is yours, Markus. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Serena. I'm not quite sure where I'm looking, but I'm just kind of looking in that area and hope that people see and understand me. I think there was something about the noise, so I'm trying to speak a little bit louder. Well, first off, very quickly, thank you very much, Sophie, and the EUGENDERING team. For choosing to, provide me with the opportunity to be in Brussels here to discuss ongoing and published work. Really appreciate that, also because of our Jean Monnet, Global Jean Monnet Center Network. And then, of course, Serena, thank you for taking the time to discuss previous work and then today to lead the moderation. David, of course, good to see you again, and that you actually took the time to read and think through some of my statements. Now, and to all of you in the audience, whoever's there, thanks for taking the time. I promise I'll make it worth it. I prepared a few slides for the next sort of 35 to 40 minutes, in which I want to highlight to you some of the major issues or contents, hypotheses, and empirics to the extent that I did them. But so before I do that, let me just see, how do I advance the PowerPoint slide?
Arrow just here.
Oh, yes, okay.
Why don't you
Thank you. Oh, that's not good. Give me a second here. Does this? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So first, a little bit about my own positionality. I'm bi-national scholar, a German origin, but I've been teaching and living in the US for 20 years in Florida. And as you can see here, this is sort of the world in which I live right now. The GOP, Florida GOP, stands for the Grand Old Party, the Republican Party. And if you know maybe a little bit about US politics, you may think that now, after 4 years, horrendous years under Trump, that with Biden is everything okay. And that's far from the reality, right? So we actually, Florida, our governor, has presidential ambition himself. And therefore, he doubles down on anything that is perceived to be progressive or woke, right? He literally coined that phrase, Florida is where wokeism goes to die. And here, this is, of course, a caricature, but here you can see just, a whole list of action that the Florida legislature under the Governor Ron DeSantis, remember his name for next year's US presidential elections, that he kind of instituted, right? And those are not only, I wanted to put this up because of sort of my own positionality and sort of that you know where I'm coming from, but also because it actually connects in some ways to my main argument of the book, in saying that the contestation and the polarization, non-polarization that we experience today is not only about LGBT rights and about gender equality, but it is really, it ought to be more broadly conceived as sort of democratic backsliding or democratic recession, or what David and others recently, I think, have termed de-democratization, right? So you see here, just in what happens in Florida, we have, of course, anti-trans law, anti-LGBT law. I'm not going to go into details because it's really about the book. But then you have also a newly instituted 6-week abortion ban, right? One of the most stringent one in the US. You anti-critical race theory. So it's also about racial and ethno-racial minorities. Anti-free press, so press freedoms, journalistic freedoms, the freedom of assembly is being curtailed as well. A fight against leftist indoctrinators at universities, and that also includes, of course, eroding tenure and eroding professorship and general anti-liberalism, right? So this is just a nutshell. But now I really want to come to the main contents of the book. And I'm going to start out just with giving you an overview of the table of contents. Just trying to do this. Give me just a second. I need to click everything. Okay, yeah. So after the introduction, in which I ask, is sort of the EU's LGBT plus rights promotion internationally, is it somehow conducive, productive of an artificial clash of civilizations, right? I then, in the second chapter, which is, I explain the theoretical framework, and that's titled From Norm Diffusion, sort of a rather simplistic assumption, to what's really going on today, norm negotiation, and particular norm contestation, okay? By the way, norm contestation is something inherent in particular international norm diffusion processes, right? They have to be contested because they're not just simplistically, magically insert themselves internationally. And I problematize the role of Europe as a normative actor. Just clicking around here. Oh, sorry, it's too much. And then the third chapter deals a little bit more technically about LGBTI rights promotion, the process of policy establishment within the EU. That means on the one hand, half the chapter is sort of about the divergence between member states, and the other half is about sort of the divergence between the different EU institutions, right? That all act and work according to their concept. And so the question is crafting consensual norm where few actually exist, right? And in order to substantiate some of the assumptions being made, I then have 3 case study chapters. The fourth one compares and contrasts what I call homophobia and Europhobia. I'm explaining that later. On the one hand, enlargement, accession policies of the EU, and on the other hand, in the neighborhood policy of the European Union, the so-called ENP, or European Neighborhood Policy. The fifth one focuses on the EU's development policies, given that the EU collectively is the world's largest development provider. And here I particularly highlight the issue of conditionality. And I will go into a little bit later that how political conditionality manifests itself in sort of unfortunate ways when interacting, particularly in post-colonial settings, as you can imagine, power asymmetries, yada, yada, yada. The sixth one then looks at the EU's multilateral promotion of LGBT rights, particularly at the UN, and here in the Human Rights Council. And here, as you can see in a few minutes, I highlight a number of issues with that as well. And then I conclude with the 7th chapter I don't have a solution to some of the unintended consequences, some of the problems, some of the norm polarization that the EU has helped to stoke, right, with all the good intentions. But I asked to sort of rethink, reflect, and reimagine international LGBT rights promotion more broadly. Because if we just focus on LGBT rights and just focus on women's and children's rights, right, as it's sometimes phrased, then we do have too narrow of a focus. Rather, it is about sort of larger democratic backsliding processes that need to be avoided if at all possible. Okay, the first chapter. Again, the question, is there an artificial clash of civilizations, right? Going back to hunting, so I'm not going to go into that. I think most of you here that are here know that the EU institutions and the governments, question mark, right? But particularly EU institutions emphasize human and LGBTI rights internally. They're set as part of the Copenhagen criteria, right? Human rights and minority rights. FRA stands for the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency, which also works towards LGBTI rights. The European Parliament, of course, is a fairly strong actor, also hosting the European Parliament's intergroup of the various cross-party folks that are interested in LGBTI issues. That is, by the way, the largest intergroup in the European Parliament, right, with 145, as well as the European Commission strategy. And von der Leyen Commission came up actually with two different strategies, right? The EU LGBTI strategy, as well as the EU gender strategy, gender equality strategy 2020-2025. So internally, we're doing, but again, these are EU institutional actors. It's very different if you look at governments. I'll return to that later. And they also increasingly start to do so externally, just in terms of the legal basis, right? In 2013, the Foreign Affairs Council established foreign policy guidelines to promote LGBTI rights. And they have also been incorporated in them later in the European Commission strategy. So rights promotion is, of course, as we all know, also advanced by rather powerful EU co-financed NGOs such as ILGA Europe, right? ILGA Europe, I would say, has privileged access to EU policymakers. And of course, they're very important actors. Or in the gender area, the European Women's Lobby, for example, would be a comparable one, right? So EU human rights promotion, I argue in the introduction, is often contested, of course, you all know, because it challenges sovereignty in the way it is that there's conditionally infused in the way the EU exploits its asymmetrical power relations, right? But theoretically, conceptually, the EU views the promotion of human rights as constitutive for its own political identity. And I make the case that many countries around the world see those same human rights norms as regulatory, right? And you can see here, if you know a little bit about norm research, there is definitely a mismatch that's unfortunate. In terms of the framework, so I'm basically considering, since I'm a political sociologist of Europe, I use here a sociological institutionalist framework focusing sort of, on logic of appropriateness and on group politics and their own identities. That is, of course, mixed with a critical constructivist IR approach and some queer and feminist observations as well, although I'm not don't consider myself a queer theorist, right? In terms of the empirics, I rely here on document analysis. I mean, I worked myself through the last decade of human rights reports to kind of substantiate some of the arguments. I had interviews with Eurocrats, with 12 Eurocrats, as well as activists, international activists. And I did a little bit of field observation, for example, at the Out Summit, which is arguably the world's largest LGBT, next to the ILGA World Conference, the world's largest activist summit. Now, the overarching research question, right, is sort of, as my title, the book title says, is the EU's international LGBTI plus promotion conducive to an improvement of LGBTI rights globally, or may it also be counterproductive of what Altman and Simmons termed queer wars, right? They came out with this whole book in 2015 about norm polarization over these issues and called it queer wars. But my implicit argument and criticism is that this is also a binary argument, right? Which, and their argument, therefore, is also binary. So I would hope that my work avoids some of that binary point of view. And more fine-grained, I ask if the EU's cooperation with international organizations such as the UN, UNDP in particular, or engagement through its own foreign policies, enlargement, neighborhood policies, makes a substantial difference. And finally, what kind of alternatives do we might have to avoid a contentious reliance on conditional human rights policies, right? Because of, remember, the regulative versus constitutive mismatch. The second chapter and the third chapter. Second chapter problematizes the notion that the EU sees itself probably as sexually exceptionalist, right? So it has its own self-understanding as a sexually liberal bloc. as well as the normative power Europe. I'm not going to go into detail. Probably all of you are familiar with the NPE concept, right? Coined initially by Ian Manners in 2002, has been reformulated many times, has been criticized many times. But I would argue that, and that came up also in interviews with EU officials, right? That normative power Europe argument is still sustained internally in EU institutions. I mean, try to criticize EU policy vis-a-vis EU officials, and you will, it's basically like talking to Jehovah's Witnesses or something. It also argues that international norms are inherently contestable, right? Antivina and others have said that, exactly, we cannot just assume simplistic norm diffusion processes. International norms, particularly outside of the domestic area, are contestable, and they are contested. So the contestation itself is a normal process and nothing that should lend itself easily for, you know, political stereotyping and creating artificial non-polarization. So then, overall, the EU's policies in terms of international LGBTI rights promotion, I argue, creates this kind of normative differentiation, simplistically said, sort of an othering, right, of others. It also then maintains, sustains, and creates geopolitical, depending how you look at it, homo or heteronormative differences, and socioeconomic inequalities that materialize, you know, in the aid provisions that are contained, for example, in the neighborhood policy or in the development policy of the EU. The chapter also then details the Eurocentric genealogy of human rights and the EU self-understanding as a messianic promoter, if I may say so, of, right, LGBTI rights, arguing that, as many scholars really have done, of course, that it is a very Eurocentric idea, and therefore it should not be considered as really universal, not in the way that we understand the universality of rights in the UN. And I critically position then the EU's actions. I critically position the EU's actions as geopolitical. I mean, the EU Global Strategy of 2016, right, has a much more strategic geopolitical outlook, and critically position the EU's policies, rights policies, in between Massad's, you know, assertion of the gay international lobby that exists and that also exists in third countries that then appropriate the EU's language and policies, and the normative power concept Europe. In the interest of time, I'm moving on. So basically, at the end, I conclude that chapter saying that rather than to universalize the EU's stances on LGBT rights, right, there is a need to provincialize, as Chakrabarty herself says, there's a need to provincialize the EU stance. And if you know a little bit about European Union studies more recently, right, there's a need to decenter or even decolonize EU foreign policies. That's an emerging field. Chapter 3 then highlights LGBT rights disparity among member states on the one hand, as well as among the fragmented EU institutions when developing and implementing those rights. Here, I'm going to switch quickly to the next slide. Well, actually, yeah, that you probably have seen this. This is ILGA, Europe's rainbow map, right? And I marked here in black from 2020, 2 years ago, but not that much has changed. I marked here in black sort of the borders of the European Union, and then the lighter borders are the candidate countries. And, you know, there is a simplistic assumption that, you know, everything is okay in the EU, but just the coloring, going from the very green ones, and Belgium does, by the way, best, right, with 73% out of 100, to the more reddish colors. Those are what we would call maybe the problematic countries, right? There's a whole range of differences amongst the member states and their national LGBT rights policies. Just to highlight, look at Georgia, okay? The Caucasus nation of Georgia has 30%, basically a third of the expected perfect ideal LGBT rights. That contrasts rather pessimistically with Italy, which is 23%, right? So again, we got to be careful about making these simplistic binary arguments, but I also put it up there to show that there's a big incoherence in terms of member states' position on LGBT rights, right? So let me quickly go back here. This chapter 3 then provides an analysis of the differences in norm acceptance beyond what we often rather simplistically call either societal homophobia or state homophobia, right? I argue in that chapter, a lot of other factors contribute to why the post-socialist states of Central and Eastern Europe are not at the same level, are not as liberal or progressive as, for example, some of the Brussels institutions or Western European nations. And those have to do, for example, with uneven economic development, right? Everything from the shock liberalization of the 90s still to the domination of Central and Eastern European markets through Western European companies. That has to do with EU interventionism. You know, if you know a little bit about the region, you know that they're very keen to express their own sovereignty. They had the sovereigntist nationalism in the 1990s. Of course, they were looking to NATO and the European Union, right, as a stabilizer and as a guarantor of prosperity. But I think many governments in the region didn't realize that, okay, if I'm part of the EU, you also have to accept a whole host of rules, regulations, policies, and normative inputs that now come to haunt the region in a way. There's also incoherence. The EU regularly, in many of its foreign policies, including neighborhood policy, including enlargement policy, as has preferential treatment for certain countries out of geopolitical reasons over others. There's also a lack of identification with the concept of Europe. So this is something that David has written about a lot, right, in some more dissimilar regions. And Europe itself, by the way, is almost as empty of a signifier as Europe, or the notion of gender equality, for that matter. Right? Okay, chapter 4 compares homophobia, mixes in together Islamophobia. We cannot disconnect those two, right? And I say here, homophobia, societal, you know, residual cultural homophobia that makes it, I mean, also Central Eastern Europe, for example. Those are in the Balkans. That's where we have the more recent member states. That's where the enlargement policy in the Balkans is still ongoing, the process that you see here in the map. There's more residual cultural societal homophobia existing, but then also, for example, natalist policies contribute to that, right? These regions experience significant demographic decline. And so therefore, LGBT relationships are seen as going against the biological family structure that would be reproductive enough, right? And therefore are not contributing. So if I do some of the analysis in the chapter, and you can see how starting with Putin and his family incentive payments, that kind of measures literally trickle through Central and Eastern Europe slowly, right? Into Serbia these days. And that, of course, also has homophobic implications. Also, the sovereigntist nationalism that I just talked about, these result in a larger Europhobia that sees the European Union and its impacts rather in negative ways, sort of considering the EU as gay Europa, right? And importantly, for example, if you look at Serbia as a case study, Serbia right now, you know, the EU is very interested in keeping Serbia on the enlargement path, keeps it motivated. Serbia knows how to exploit that. Serbia is also, you know, has a Orthodox culture, Serbian Orthodox culture, right, which is, you know, a little bit more homophobe. Is also, there's some misinformation through the Putin government going on because Russia is the historical protector and ally of Serbia. But Serbia also exploits basically both sides, right, and plays this game. And there are instrumental reforms made that are not really lasting, that are also reversible. We've seen some of the non-discrimination directives, some of the same-sex procedure that were introduced in the process of EU enlargement, later being reversed through technical matters or through popular plebiscites, exactly, in Romania, in Croatia, and so on and so on. So I call these reversible Potemkin reforms, right? Basically, the EU sets out the benchmarks in the accession process. The countries jump to these pro forma hoops to achieve those benchmarks, but once they're members, a lot of that, again, the conditional pressure ceases. And then, you know, in the name of the family or in the name of religion or in the name of the population, some of these fake Potemkin reforms are being reversed. In neighborhood policies, there are not even the incentives of EU membership, right? So, and plus geopolitical stability considerations trump true normative transformation. So I digged a little bit in the data, democratic indicators over time. If you're interested, I'm sorry. I'm going to switch. I'm going to, out of interest, I'm going to leave this. This is the Bertelsmann indicator of the quality of democracy from 2014 to 2020. So if you look at the bottom, you can see that some of the countries that are recent recipients of the EU's normative overtures have actually regressed quite a bit. Those are accession candidates, but those are also neighborhood countries, right? So I do a little bit of empirical digging in to kind of also show empirically that the EU's impact in the neighborhood is really rather lacking, which has actually, by the way, the EU itself has mentioned that. So the European neighborhood currently is being reformed/abolished because it's been shown to be rather ineffective in a lot of ways, not only with regards to human rights improvements, and it's been submerged into this larger NDICI, international instrument of the European Union. Okay, chapter 5. Moving on. Chapter 5 then deals with development policy and the conditionality and its discontents, right? The EU channels and is collectively the 27. It's channeled through Brussels, the largest development aid or ODA provider. But of course, regional preferences for EU aid to particular 79 former colonies, the aid recipient African, Caribbean, and Pacific or ACP states do exist. Plus, what we've seen more recently, if you look into the literature more closely, the NDICI, larger international instrument package that I just noticed, they literally make a very clear migration, development, security linkage. Okay, so basically, we give you money. The EU Trust Fund for Africa does the same that the EU established in 2015. We give you money so that you keep the migrants out. Right? That's just one of the unfortunate linkages of the EU's development policy. So this rights conditionality that is included in verbatim into the treaties that the EU concludes with those 79 and other third countries is also regularly raised in the so-called political dialogues. Political dialogues are informal meetings between EU administrators and countries, particularly if there are some human rights issues occurring. These regularly lead to conflicts, right? For example, just to cite an example, in 2014, there was the EU-Africa summit, and Martin Schulz, the then European Parliament president, admonished the African counterpart, saying, like, you know, you're not doing enough on LGBTI rights, right? You know, Uganda was very hot at the time. And African governments came together and said, like, who are you to talk to us about, right? You're basically slaughtering our people at Europe's borders, you know, so who are you to talk about? So they make this linkage as well as a repartee. Johannes Sartnes and we also wrote an article in the Journal of Common Market Studies 2021, in which we kind of dig deeper into the political conditionality. And we said, well, they're combated on two levels by third countries, the EU's conditionality, LGBTI rights conditionality. On the one hand, it's about the content of the LGBTI rights norm. So that refers back to that countries like Uganda may be more, you know, societally, politically homophobe. But it is also the application of conditionality that matters, right? So if we're analyzing then these kind of norm polarizations with third countries, we should, that's our argument, we should really look at these two levels at which norm polarization occurs. The norm itself and the way the norm is inserted or applied. That's a moment Raman termed it homocolonialism, right? There's also the term Ebola from Brussels, right? And so on and so on. It is, of course, I mentioned this, so I'm going to keep it quick. It's seen as hypocritical by the EU itself in face of the EU's increasingly protectionist, self-serving trade, security, and refugee policies that, remember, occur in a post-colonial setting, right, with some of the residual misgivings and in neoliberal contexts. I mean, the EU itself, the post-Cotonou agreement that ended 2020. In year 2020 is still not concluded. And part of the reason are these issues, right? Part of the reason is also that the EU wants to replace some of the aid agreements with economic partnership agreements, which were much more self-serving, much more like trade agreements that would open up third countries' markets to the European Union. I then, in this chapter, include 3 case studies that are emblematic for some of the world regions. I look here at Uganda, obviously a hot button topic, right? I'm not talking much about these cases, maybe in the Q&A if it's interesting. I talk about Jamaica, also a notorious country in terms of LGBTI rights, but the largest and emblematic for the Caribbean. Both of these, right, there homosexuality was, by the way, criminalized by the United Kingdom. So it's kind of particularly ironic, right? When the United Kingdom, until recently, approached these countries saying, like, we're cutting our aid if you don't, do better. And Indonesia. Indonesia is a little bit is an interesting case for Southeast Asia, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. And Indonesia has also become, the LGBTI rights have become more polarized, but not because the Dutch had a criminalized LGBT right. No, Indonesia is trying to assert its own nationalism against Dutch liberalism of the early 20th century, right? So they're saying we don't want that European Dutch colonial liberalism. We want to return to sort of an Indonesian set of more conservative values. These, I come out saying that there are limited EU means in terms of the aid provisions, largely ineffective results that I trace over time in the case studies as well, and increasingly geopolitical pressures. For example, the EU is also very careful how far they push Uganda. The European Parliament may have all kinds of insignificant resolutions against Uganda, but the Commission and the European Council is much more careful because they know that Uganda is also one of the largest migrant hosting countries in Africa themselves. Right? It's basically the Turkey of Africa. And we don't want basically those folks to end up at our borders again. In Jamaica, with Brexit, Jamaica is also being treated by the EU in an ambiguous manner because Jamaica is a former British colony. Also, they don't know if Jamaica will turn to the UK rather and say like, and basically says like, if the EU pressures us too much on human rights matter, we may just, turn to the United Kingdom. In Indonesia, the Chinese influence, right, is quite noticeable. So overall, the EU should rethink conditional linking of LGBT rights to trade and aid conditionality and more carefully calibrate its relations. The last substantive chapter in the UN. I'm going to keep this short. The first line tells you that the UN is a broad but volatile forum for LGBTI rights promotion. The UN General Assembly, the third committee, which deals with social, cultural, economic rights, and I focus particularly on the Human Rights Council in that chapter. I ask, has there been process of the European External Action Service in trying to promote over the last 10, 15 years LGBTI rights? And again, progress is in quotation marks because the main argument of that chapter is that progress that the Europeans, together with Latin American countries, they are assembled here, you see this in the UN core group, that progress in achieving a independent expert on LGBTI rights in getting the free and equal campaign through has come with greater international norm polarization. And sort of my argument is greater international norm polarization over LGBTI rights is not helpful in the long run, right? So this chapter examines the EU access and strategic use, framing, negotiating, and voting. And I say here there are three issues that the EU has. One is normative. Obviously, you know by now, so I keep this short, that European norm contestation in the Human Rights Council is based on Eurocentric norm entrepreneurship. The sexual exceptionalism, everyone should act like us, independent of the context. Right? There's also, of course, in the UN itself, a debate over the SOGI rights base. SOGI stands for sexual orientation and gender identity, right? As you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when it was devised in 1948, 49, sexual orientation was not an issue, so it wasn't mentioned. And many activists and governments make now this argument, well, it's included in gender. But as you know, there's this differentiation where conservative governments try to separate out gender into women and girls as opposed to LGBT plus populations. So these are normative issues. Then we have also political issues. The EU assembles the world's colonizing nations. Therefore, the EU already acts in the UN in sort of a very volatile space, right? And its high visibility, including the EU, by the way, is the only institution that has in the UN an enhanced service. No regional organization has that, right? And the African Union was very much against the EU's enhanced observer station and said, what about us? Why don't we get that, right? So the EU's high profile institutional political setting elicits, of course, counter reactions as well. And then finally, there are organizational issues. Again, the EU its fragmentation, the 27 member states, the EU, the 5 main institutions, it's wonderful to have, but you can imagine that if the EU tries to formulate a joint position that then they can put forward in Geneva in the UN Human Rights Council, that takes a lot of time to internally get agreement on the 27. Plus, if you know something about EU politics, the EU will only put proposals forward that are basically consensually approved. So a lot of the initiatives will not ever get approved, will not ever get introduced. And when they're introduced, then other countries, Russia, the organization, the Islamic Organization of States, African countries had enough time to, develop counter amendments to protect their family rights, religious rights, and societal rights. So the EU's high visibility politics of optics. Yes, we made progress. We got the UN independent expert going. That comes with non-polarization and politicization of rights in the UN. To conclude, I'm saying I don't have a solution, to be honest, but we cannot just see rights contestation as, oh, it's those countries, those backward countries, right? That would be unjust. It's also not just the strategic use of LGBTI rights, either positively the emulation in terms of pink washing or gender bashing, right? So states have used now to go either one of these two roads down. But really, that occurs within broader democratic setbacks. And we have to realize that. So we're talking here rather about the democratic backsliding that we need to recognize in third countries rather than a backlash. And so I would urge you not to myopically focus only on LGBT human rights violations. Civil society is an essential promoter, but not a sufficient one. And you can imagine, in the book, I explained it a little bit more in detail. We need to have sort of the vertical factor, right, domestically. It takes a village, basically. It takes all of us. It takes the political elites. It takes the NHRIs, which stands for National Human Rights Institution. By the way, scholarly literature has said more could be done with those. It takes the independence of courts, which is why autocratic countries increasingly attack courts. It takes economic conditions, right? The neoliberalism that has its own negative impact, cultural conditions, and the inclusion of democratic quality. And those interact then with the various international ones that I mentioned here. So what is to be done? First of all, more critical self-reflection from the EU is needed. And that is still lacking despite midterm reviews of papers of the EU. The EU also needs to become more coherent. That means it needs to strengthen its internal rights regime and its refugee rights regime, and equally address other severe international human rights issues, right? Such as, the Uyghurs in China that we're not really tackling, or in very sort of ambiguous ways because of the eminent trade relations with China. External policies need to be more coherent. There cannot be this geopolitical cherry picking by the EU saying like preferring Serbia's insufficient LGBTI rights because it is important for the stability of the region over other countries that do much better, right? But also with less conditional pressure. And it needs a more intersectional policy, a more broadly based sort of social, we use the word social justice movement, right? But it really takes a more broad-based institution. We also, LGBTI rights violations do not occur in justice. They go hand in hand with attacks on gender equality, women's rights in particular. They go hand in hand with attacks on universities. David, you have just recently published on, right, sort of the specter of cultural Marxism and misuse. They go on attacks on the media, right, on courts. So again, there are lots of indications, and we need to have this broader picture to accordingly act. The EU has had some strategic plans. For example, the EU Action Plan on Democracy and Human Rights and the EU Gender Action Plan. They supply more money. Can you hear me? Oh. Yeah, okay, I finished up here. The EU Gender Action Plan supplies more money for civil society support as well as for human rights defenders, right? So we have to see how this will pan out. The National Human Rights Institution could be approached. Even the private sector could play a larger role, and that should be sort of a natural ally given the EU's genesis as a single market. So just to conclude, it's more important to see LGBTI rights violations within the broader democratically regression setback picture, and approach it more intersectionally, right? Build a more broader social justice movement, and for the EU to be more self-reflective. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is very fascinating, insightful, and opening so many different questions. But I will now immediately give the floor to David for the discussion so that we can also have time for conversation later on. Thank you, David. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. I will try not to be too long so that we have actually time for you to respond and then for the conversation. So the first thing I would like to say thank you also to be invited to go back to some of my older interests before anti-gender campaigns. And I think, I mean, I really love the book because I think it's one of the few books and even few articles, because there is almost nothing on EU international policy in relation to LGBT rights, which is an expanding terrain. There is increased pressure from the Commission, from several states to do something, and there are some things in the making. There's some books that will be published soon, but at the moment there is not much. So I think it is good to have this piece, and I think that the book brings nicely together all these different elements that were hard to find, or that we could find somewhere in some op-eds over there, or people in the field knew about, but then there was nothing putting all that together. And I think that it's a major contribution of the book to put all that together, and also to contribute to broader debates in EU policies, especially normative Europe that you have developed at the beginning. I think probably you could even just write a piece on that, so recycling the ideas, just what is your contribution to the debate about normative Europe only, because I think there is a lot, but I think you can even push that further or to make it clear, because there is definitely something, and I will come back to that in a second, where you could add something. The other thing that I love a lot is the inclusion of this decolonial, post-colonial, decentered approach of EU studies, although we also criticize part of that in relation to the research design in a second. But I really love the willingness to include that, because I mean, one of the there are many problems I think with EU studies, and I do that as an outsider, but one of them, it is really self-centered, and especially, and it is directly connected to the problem of Eurocentrism, and your project of provincializing EU studies and also the study of EU, I think is important, is an important contribution. And I think on my side, one of the most transformative academic conferences, partly academic, but was in South Africa, invited by Sonia Correa in this dialogue, where I was the only European in a room of 40 people to talk about Europe. And then you just realize that Europe is just a very small place in the world, and the world is vast, and there are more people. And then we come with our European values. I mean, I still don't know what are European values, and I still believe it's not a generous concept, in a sense that if human rights are European values, well, it's not very nice to people outside of Europe about human rights, unless you fall into what you're describing in the book. And I think the book does there a very nice work in showing, especially in the first chapters, showing the theoretical tensions and problems around that constructions, and where it could lead. And then we have the case studies explaining what, but this is what's happening completely on the ground. And maybe we need to rethink those things if we want to solve those problems. And it's partly, I think, normative and theoretical issues. So I think these are great contributions. Having said that, if you want to go further, I would push you, at least in the research design, I would suggest to be more comparative in at least two ways. One, I was very surprised. I said, okay, what you say about the EU is very much in line with what you could find in migration studies, things about asylum, etc., where people are really critical of Fortress Europe, and they generally don't like too much the EU. Then I said, but that's strange. The people I know better than migration, gender, and politics, Alison is there, for instance, they love the EU. And there was more institutional faith, at least at some point. I think the literature has changed, but there was really this idea that the EU could make a difference and could be a venue where to change things. And I was surprised, because I think you have less institutional faith than this literature. And at least, and I think if you compare the issues, you will have the migration people who would be very critical. The gender people would be less critical, or in a different way. I think it has changed, and definitely with democratic backsliding it is changing. But there's still the idea that the EU is a key contributor to more gender equality internally, but also internationally. And I would say LGBTI things are in the middle, still with the strong conviction that the EU can do something, but also more critical. And I would say in the academic literature, depends on which field. So international relations, they will be more critical. EU studies, they will be less critical. So I mean, and I think that would be interesting to open more kind of a dialogue with those different fields of research, because that would probably bring even new things and new ideas if you want to go further with this project. And the other thing, and is where I'm not sure that in the research design you provincialize Europe that much, but it's very much EU studies, is that I was wondering first, what about the US under Obama or Biden? Is there LGBTI international action different from the one in Europe, in the EU? And then you could add, what about Canada? What about the UK? Know that they're longer with us in Europe.
Yeah, making this project very big.
No, but I think that would be great, especially if you take the UK. Are the UK more colonial? And they're usually concerned about the former colonies. What about the US or what about Canada, which would be a very different case? But these are different entities that actually do external LGBTI promotion. And especially when you talk about the UN, you have the chapter about the UN and the action of the EU at the UN, which I think is great. But then what happens when you bring these other actors who are also at the UN and these coalitions, because they sometimes work together. So there I was wondering, would it change the narrative or not? And in what sense? And I really don't know. So it's really an open question. And it's also a developing field of research. There is a nudge on this topic. There is a book about the UK that we published in a book series. There is another one about queer diplomacy. Yeah. There is no one about queer diplomacy. So these are people some you know. So I think that would be interesting as maybe one way or even a panel at the conference or something. Then I had I was wondering about the project and had smaller questions. About the intellectual and political project, I had two questions. One you have already partly answered, but still. The first thing I was wondering while I was reading the book, who you would like to read your book, or who is the audience? Is it written, or both, for practitioners, and what sort of practitioner? For students, for academics? And then the question is, have you already heard from practitioners, both in institutions and in NGOs? And what do they think of the book and the argument, which I would be very interested in. And then the question that was connected to that is really what to be done. So you have ended, I think even more clearly than in the book, with ideas, but I think still they're not, for a policymaker, they're still not very concrete. So I wonder if you get a phone call from people who could have come today, who work in NGOs or who work for the European Commissioner for Equality or the External Service, and who ask you, and I'm sure you know some of them from the interviews I could gather in my head, and they call you, okay, that's nice, but then what should we do? So concretely, what is the way to go? And there it's really a dilemma, and I think we have been very careful not to be binary, but it's really the dilemma about, okay, we see the problems, we see the pitfalls, but we still believe we need to do something. And so what should we do, although we know it can be problematic? And I don't have the answer, so it's really an open question about how to do it. And then I had tiny, more small questions, and one is that I really enjoyed the chapter on conditionality, but then there is another additional layer, and you mentioned it partly, which is no conditionality is also used within the EU, partly to address the inconsistencies that you have, that you mentioned and you developed in your book. And especially we see that now with Poland, with the anti-LGBT zones, and we see that in Hungary now. So we all got this message from the European Commission, we should stop working with Hungarian universities if we get EU research money and that sort of things. So it's a new mechanism implied internally. And about the LGBT-free zones, I was very much, I was not convinced, and I even wrote an op-ed with a former postdoc in a newspaper about that, in the case of Poland. But then I have to say, actually, it worked. So maybe I was wrong. So I was very sympathetic to your arguments, and these were the arguments I was using against conditionality, or saying, look, it can be dangerous and it can be polarizing, which is, I think, the main danger. But on the other hand, it works. So I don't know, maybe there, to see especially how it has worked, at least in Poland, I don't know what to say. The practitioners will tell me, yeah, but that's good, but that's theoretical bullshit. But see, on the ground, that's actually something we can do and something that can work. So I don't know, and again, I don't have the answer. And then I had smaller questions, the notion of Europhobia. I liked it, but I would be, I mean, I have several questions. First, I would like, if you could develop it more. And maybe theoretically, if you think it has a broader potential, because now it is about a specific region, as you have shown in the PowerPoint, but if you want to bring it, to turn it into a broader concept, how you would develop it. And I've always also with homophobia, I've always the problem with the fear element.
The phobia.
Is it really a phobia? And is it fear a very useful concept to work with when we try to address resistances or opposition, and then is it the same thing as Islamophobia or homophobia? Do we speak about the same sort of thing? Because we can imagine a fear which can be irrational, including also, I mean, this is my problem in phobia, but we can also include something that is irrational about the fear towards certain people. Is it exactly the same thing? And then I wasn't sure about the link to Islamophobia that we mentioned again. I see some countries where you discuss it and we see how it works, and it works lionishly. But then I say, and you mentioned it in the book, okay, but there is Turkey, but there is also Albania, but there is also Bosnia. There is also the strange case of Chechnya and how Putin uses Chechnya. So how does it work, and would it be valid in Western Europe? Or could we build the same connection between Europhobia and Islamophobia in Western Europe or not? Or how do you see it? I don't know. It's a really open question how you would connect the two things. But NVA, they can be anti-Muslim, but not necessarily anti-EU, or how does it play out? I don't know.
NVA is we were discussing
Flemish nationalist.
That we were discussing. I was telling you that they were marching at the Pride, but for a very homo-nationalist.
And interestingly, the European Parliament, they are in the same group as Vox and PiS, the Polish party, and I think it has an influence on their international policy, because suddenly we see NVA at events where they shouldn't be. Far-right nationalist events, strange sorts of events, where I think they probably come also because of some of their friends. And then the other thing, and it will be the final question, is what do you think today is the role of LGBTI rights in European construction? In a sense that I think there is a literature focusing on the national level, looking at what is the role of homosexuality, LGBT, I would say mostly LGBT, much more than TEOI issues, in nation building, in building an image of itself, etc., etc. And so connecting to what you have just said, because I think it's really an argument that goes through with the book, is really what is the main, I mean, what would be the role of those rights also connected to values today in what Europe is trying to build, and also the image that Europe is building of itself, which I think is in the book, but then it's just a way to conclude.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's really a lot of food for thought. I think that we can, before engaging maybe with the audience, if you would like to react or to share some thoughts, Markus, with concerning some of the points that David was raising.
Absolutely. So thank you, David, for your in-depth read and the comments. So with regards to the research design, I think, it makes sense. I mean, Alistair, I don't know how you consider, but it makes sense, right, that gender equality studies scholar in the EU would see the EU as a more positive actor than LGBTI scholars. I mean, there's the ones that Phil and others, right, who said that had a very important internal impact, but a lot of, and you hopefully this came across, in the book, a lot of the contextual background conditions that then determine the way norm negotiation plays out internationally are not present outside of the EU's border, right? And so therefore, yeah, it's true. During the research and even before, I've become a much more of a pessimist about the EU's human rights promotion, right? The further I dig in, the more red flags or red rainbow flags I've seen, right? With regards to the comparative project, that would be quite interesting. But as you said, I mean, I know that Matthew is already doing a lot of the Commonwealth analysis work and focus on the UK. So I really didn't want to go there. Plus, I don't know about you, but I had to become a Brexit scholar for the last 5 years unwillingly, and I'm kind of done with the UK's role in the world for the next couple of years. And you know, the difference, I think. I do think that's why the subtitle is Promises and Pitfalls. I think there's still the EU. And again, I obviously attack the Eurocentricity of those norms. And I'm very glad that even in parochial EU studies, where most folks are white, that we now get to an acceptance that we really need to decenter, some say, or Orbit and others, that we need to decolonize EU studies. And I think that's great, and I want to participate in that in the future as well. But the EU also has this promise, and the promise that I see in terms of EU human rights promotion, let's call it this way, is that the EU as an institutional actor doesn't have the same kind of accountability and electoral pressures that the countries have, right? And living in the US, I can see this very well. I mean, I showed you what happens in Florida despite the Biden administration. By the way, it's not just Florida. That is by now 17 states, right? Texas is the next one, 17 states that already have anti-trans laws on the books, and more are to be expected in the coming years. So the US is a very inconsistent actor. So, I mean, it would be interesting to do that. And I actually am, you got me thinking about this, so probably not afterwards we will have to chat a little bit about potential collaboration.
You know that Biden is the administration. I see LGBTI activists from all over the place. He's flying to the US regularly. The same would happen with Obama. So there is really a willingness from the White House to work on those issues and also to include these issues in their international policy.
But as much damage has been done by the Trump administration, right?
Yeah.
Plus, if we also think about, I mean, the US in that sense is a much more of it's become a changing, ambivalent, unreliable actor, and even in the United Nations, right?
So friendly.
yes. No, but I'm sorry, but that's right. That's kind of like that's how I consider it. Them, and also related to the US. I mean, what's kind of interesting is that a lot of the sort of EU internal homophobic, anti-gender movements that come out are supported by US conservative institutions, right? I mean, it's literally Steve Bannon who tries to establish, remember, this elite university in Italy, right? To spread, to increase the fight against gender ideology. And it's this US evangelical network that, and I mentioned this in the book too, right? Channels hundreds of millions of dollars into Europe as well as Africa to stoke the norm polarizations over that. So in that sense, right, it would be interesting to do a comparative work, but you're blowing up a project to something.
I'm not sure it's that different in a sense that you have the EU trying to do LGBTI policies, and then you have its homophobic members. And you could say the same with the US. You have the US under democratic administrations, and then you have certain states like Florida. Florida, I mean, there was this good title, I think, in the New York Times. Is Florida the new Hungary?
Yep.
And I think that would be a basis for comparison.
Absolutely. I mean, for the future, maybe.
Someone else.
You're well situated. You should keep.
Yes, thank you. No, seriously. I mean, it was definitely. I was really thinking about that. I need to talk to whoever wants to collaborate on that issue because I think there are some good comparisons to be made. Well, who's the audience? Yes. I think I said this already on Wednesday at another talk, but I try to really. It's not mentioned. I didn't target sort of a small audience of experts, but my ambition is always to basically draw on as many people as possible. So I also try to simplify a lot of the lingo and the language and the research design, And I also straddle the lines. I mean, I am a scholar, but I'm a scholar of EU studies. I can rattle down I can go down the EU institutionalist wormhole for hours if you want to, which I did in chapter 3, which is a little bit much for many readers probably, but it is necessary, right? Because I wanted to be read by IR scholars as well as by EU studies scholars. So that in short. With regards to how do I have ambitions that practitioners, activists, yes, I would love for more activists that I interviewed and that I'm in touch with to know of it. And therefore I freely share it openly, irrespective of the copyright, but I know there's states, I have to be careful. I don't have any ambitions about the EU because I don't know what your experiences is, but when I talk to EU actors on this or for the previous project on the fundamental rights agencies, it's like talking against the wall. The EU has Eurocrats have adopted for themselves also a sort of an institutional political identity, and there's a lot of inflexibility.
But I think it has partly changed, or at least they want to do something, or recent. But I think sometimes they're also trapped in the institutional complexity. I mean, my understanding, the people working in the equality administration, they wanted to do something against Hungary or Poland, but they just can't do anything. Or they were looking for the institutional way to do something. Or no, this project that we were working with the external service, they want to do something. But then I said, I pointed out in the meeting the problems of the inconsistency that you mentioned. Okay, you do that, but what about internally? Or what if these things happening externally are supported by EU actors? No, it should be, this is not our mandate. This would be another part of the EU or the Commission. So I think sometimes they're trapped in this complexity and with the problem of how you make an agreement, how you work with another part of the same institution.
We were talking about this more kind of institutional design kind of problems related also to the fact that they cannot really act intersectionally because they are. Do you remember we were mentioning exactly the same point? I think it's very important.
But I think they would love to have. I mean, I think it's good if they get more critical points, and it's good to have a dialogue because sometimes they need ideas about how to do it.
I'm here, so I mean, you have more context, so let me know in case they really want to hear. So with regard to quickly your question about, political conditionality actually did work in Poland, right? Yes, it may have worked for now. A, the question is how sustainable it is, and B, again, EU internal setting is a whole different contextual background than the post-colonial setting with which the EU interacts, in which, I mean, that's my focus is on the international, third country promotion. And I think there the EU has much higher credibility benchmarks to reach than with Poland. Plus Poland, I mean, we go into detail, but I also feel like it gets now, that may have worked, but it also gets a little bit comparative to Hungary, better treatment because it hosts all the Ukrainian refugees that's why we're not going to touch it, and so on. So next year is our election, and hope is that there's a change anyway, right? So there are a couple of these kind of contextual things.
Also, again, we need time, no? To see if it has worked or not, because like what we can learn from conditionality, the Western Balkans enlargements, like many things, they look like at the beginning, yes, with intersectionality everywhere, remember, yes, conditionality has worked because now on paper we have new policies, new legislation and so on, but then we got completely stuck at the level of implementation, for instance, so this is also a way to say that maybe conditionality has not worked. Fully.
But it's also a question of political timeline.
Yeah.
Because a political actor often, I mean, there's the long-term impact, but you also need more concrete and rapid results. And in that sense, it has worked, but with the problem of the long term. Or the
also because socially, like what...
Yes, but I mean, it has worked. Let's say, I mean, then you have the recovery fund tranches, right, that are outstanding still. So it works while Poland is still expecting incentives or benefits from its,
this is the problem of
temporary. Yes, exactly. Which is, again, goes back to my contestation of political conditionality. And at least we tried, based on the work that I did with Johanne, try to kind of also fine tune or have a more fine-grained analysis of conditionality, right? So that there's the one hand the norm that is expressed through it, and then there's the way in which that norm is being I don't know, imposed, approached, diffused, right?
And the other thing is whether it works with other global actors or regional actors, Russia and China, mostly.
Yes.
With no human rights conditionality.
Plus, there's a different kind of asymmetrical game that the EU plays, right? Obviously. And then, the EU phobia. Yeah, I haven't really worked much more on this because just like you, I'm wary about the concept of phobia because, again, in the book, I'm basically explaining in the second chapter, it's not really about a total rejection out of fear. That is part of it, but that's not the whole story, right? It's about sort of also not being able to engage really in norm negotiation and in norm contestation. I think we see norm contestation as something rather negative, and of course the EU doesn't like norm contestation because it wants to have an asymmetrically shaped relationship, but then they shouldn't be surprised at the unintended consequences of that, norm imposition, let's say. And the link to migration, I don't know, it kind of made sense for me. And I think it's quite interesting because in migration in Central and Eastern Europe, or even in Central and Eastern Europe, is very differently configured. So whereas here, right, we basically have this sort of, we use LGBT rights to, remember, going back to Wednesday, to distinguish good Europeans, liberal Europeans, from the bad, already existing migrant populations that are homophobe, that are already in the EU. In Central and Eastern Europe, if you look at it, there are no major migrant populations. So, and here, that's why I draw that parallel, because also LGBT populations are much less vocal in those countries. They've become more vocal recently because of the contestation, right? But they're not as powerful in Central and Eastern Europe. They're not as vocal. So I almost make that parallel. We talk here about almost two invisible populations around which a conjoined phobia develops. Does that make sense? That's how I try to explain it in the book.
If I may, as a chair, jump in. We have 10 minutes.
Okay,
left.
Sorry, take a second. No, so this is basically, and then finally, the last, what's the role of the, I said I don't have the solution to the problems. I do just think, actions have consequences, and particular high visibility actions have highly pronounced consequences, often unintended, and the EU needs to live with it. But again, a more reflective self-position would be the first step, aside from the more concrete recommendations I give at the end. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to both of you. Maybe we can open the floor to the audience, to whoever has questions, comments, would like to share reflections. Is there anyone who would like to
Don't be shy,
jump
do
in?
a small circle.
Sophie, please go ahead. You are muted.
Sorry, but I don't want maybe to step on the toes of anyone else, but
We
maybe
have no other hand raised at the moment, so I think you can,
Maybe Alison. No. I just wanted to ask Markus a question, continuing on the tension that David underlined, which is very at the center of that. How do you escape this conundrum of polarization and politicization, which emphasize on the one hand some values as an identity marker for the EU, and then will lead to consolidate some rights and continue going forwards, but on the same time also emphasize contestations and conflicts. And so this is a real conundrum, I think, and I wanted to ask you maybe in relation to something that you couldn't tackle in the book, which is the war in Ukraine, in fact, because the support of the EU to Ukraine in the official discourse is in part justified by the need to defend democracy, but also the liberal value system, including LGBTIQ rights. could this lead to a sort of consolidation of these rights as a marker of the EU external dimension? Or what could be the results of that out of the conundrum, I would say? And also, have you really heard this argument of the support to Ukraine also on the basis of these value elements? I think we have heard them, but they could have been more put to the front, maybe.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. That's really a good question. I mean, so how to escape, right? Sort of the increasing polarization without, worsening the picture. I think there are two sort of answers. One more focused on the EU itself, and one that's more focused on the actors with which EU engages. So one that came out of the case studies is so that I had the general feeling that the EU also needs to downplay its own profile, right, in the international sphere when engaging with others. So basically lowering the asymmetry in the relations, lowering its exception status in the UN Human Rights Council, and also, and I've seen this, interestingly, starting with Mogherini in the EU Global Strategy, kind of abstaining a little bit more from putting forth LGBTI rights so prominently, right? And that means sometimes just taking out LGBTI rights and subsuming them under gender equality, if possible, in EU documents. But it also, sometimes I can see already the beginnings of a more intersectionally conceived EU foreign policy approach, okay? That would be great. So that needs to be strengthened. And Richard Young then, from Carnegie Europe, he really gave also some good suggestions that I built in. And he basically said, the EU also needs to be, again, mainstream civil society support among all EU foreign policy. And the same what happened with gender equality. They need to mainstream civil society support in a social justice intersectional manner. And the EU should also look at not the usual suspects. We should not only fund the usual suspect of internationalized NGOs when engaging or supporting civil society in third countries, right? Because as you probably know, if you looked a little bit at sort of how the EU engages civil society groups, a lot of them are, of course, in order to just get EU money in the Balkans, you have to have a good command of English, you have to know about the EU works, you have to be able to have financial auditing and all this stuff. That leaves basically the EU usually engages with sort of these already internationalized NGOs that are seen as potential foreign agents, right? Because of EU foreign funding. By the way, ironically, the EU now wants to do a similar EU foreign funding law here with regards to EU civil society. The same that they criticize in other countries like Hungary or Serbia, but that's a different story. So I think this is a way concretely how to at least improve on that issue. Now with regards to Ukraine and Russia, if I correctly understood your question, I looked a little bit into the Ukraine because obviously the Crimean invasion was already ongoing while I was writing the book. And I think Maria is her name, Maria Shetsova. She highlights in her analysis really well sort of how the Ukraine was sort of torn, right? On the one hand, between Russian engagement, Putin trying to reestablish, pull it back into its sphere of influence, and of course the European Union through the revolutions, and then particularly she looks at how the EU was able to actually get the Ukraine's free trade agreement that had all these anti-discrimination provisions contained with regards to gender and LGBT rights. And her explanation was that a lot of the policymakers at the time and the population said already back then in 2015, when the agreement was forged between the EU and Ukraine, that, this is literally her quote, okay? It's better to have gay pride parades in Kiev streets than Russian tanks. Okay, so it's sort of like the EU is in that sense, just the lesser evil of both, if you want to say so, right? But now what's interesting, and that goes back to since the invasion, there was recently a really good foreign policy article written by an independent analyst. I think Chisholm is her name, and she said, now during the war, I mean, obviously the military is the most highly respected institutional actor in the Ukraine, but there are also more and more LGBT plus soldiers that are coming out and telling their story in Ukraine. And so what we see now is sort of a public opinion change in Ukraine based on sort of the making visible previously invisibilized LGBT plus soldiers that are fighting for the war, right? And I think this is really interesting to kind of keep in mind and keep an eye out, because that would then also contribute to, I guess, a more organic refashioning of attitudes in Ukraine in the long run.
Something similar happened with the Roma as well.
Oh, with the Roma, yeah, exactly.
This is very fascinating.
All minorities.
Yeah, indeed. But how to legitimize also, certain invisibilities becoming visible because they now protect, the nation from.
Yes. This is critical in its own. There's a own critical aspect towards us.
But it's interesting. And, is anyone else willing to add something for the last couple of minutes that we have?
Come on, there must be something.
There is, but it's so big.
Come on, someone else, please. I'm curious. I want to hear.
Well, I'm actually there's a small thing, and it kind of relates to the backlash issue and radicalization of civil society.
Yeah.
So your advice, dim a bit and go forward under the radar.
I'm not the biggest fan of visibility.
In what I see in both environmental movements and in LGBTI rights movements, they're rising to the bait. So there is this debate to availability of trans identity across the way as something that's new for the relatively new in the movement itself, the LGBTI movement. How do we stand in terms of trans? And trans is sort of this wedge that's coming in, which ultimately affects all sorts of other kinds of rights around gender knowledge and also LGBTI rights, women's rights. So this very skilled opposition that has helped in this polarization, because what you do is you react from an activist point of view, you react strongly to this kind of thing. The same thing goes with the abortion discussion, which has come up again also here. So we have right now a very active abortion discussion in Parliament around extending the right of abortion. Right. Which is bringing all sorts of trolls out. So I was philosophically thinking about, well, that's nice advice, but you don't talk about the changed context for civil society activism and the opposition, which David knows how skilled it is these days on many fronts.
Yeah, I mean, talk to some of these international activists over there, and I think this is an unresolved tension that we have, right? Again, however, I fall on that wayside of saying, okay, too much visibility is not good, right? And too much of that counter, because you're stoking. I mean, then also civil society activists continue to stoke the polarization around that issue and making it worse. I'm not sure that some of the stuff that ILGA, for example, did actually helped the trans movement, which, by the way, in itself is so diverse, right? We talked about this and has its own contradictory positions. And I would say that probably the trans issue will become, like now that, for example, in the US, right, this same-sex marriage has become the norm after the Supreme Court decision. And obviously the sky didn't fall out, right? Life went on. So that's why now they focus on the trans issue as a more easily mobilizable issue. So I think we shouldn't just fall. If it's a more easily mobilizable emotional issue, I hope that civil society activists don't fall in the same trap that the right wing do. I think I would rather recommend, if I was to support or consult for EU project, I would say, or activists, I would tell ILGA and others. Yeah, I mean, but they do this, of course, implicitly already, really work harder on building a more broader social justice movement. But as you know, that is difficult too, right? Because this is very difficult because of all the competitive tendencies within civil society groups, when it comes to funding.
But also funds, yeah.
Funds. I mean, when you talk about, you know yourself, like how the trans issue divides the feminist movements, right? Yeah. Sort of, so again, these are, of course, always theoretical positions, but yeah, over time, I'm not a big friend of visibility. Sometimes I don't know.
Well, I mean, it sounded like wise advice, but I was going like, and it's also because of you didn't take up much the temporal aspect of today, so there is this kind of backlash, but there is also Corona, COVID, Ukraine, as you know,
absolutely
running in the background, and you might be sick of Brexit, but in terms of our movements in Brussels, the absence of the Brits is important.
Yes,
I think
yes.
I notice it more and more. There's nobody that can really fluently take up the thread. There isn't that background that was present in the UK, including of people of color. It's getting built up, but it's still this kind of incredible background, well, it's basically a vacuum, that hasn't, in my opinion, in terms of what's going on, hasn't been adequately filled. So there's these kinds of things that are going on behind here. But I was really happy to be able to come and listen to this book. It sounds like an IR book, which is really, sounds a little bit like a nice partner to Anna van der Vleuten's work, which was really missing for what gender equality policy makes. And now we have this one. I think it's quite an achievement. So I'm sorry that there's not La Monde here, but La Monde est là.
I can send it to you anyway.
Yeah.
And you got a very clear overview of the book. I think the way it was presented was extremely clear.
Yes, absolutely.
No, I really appreciate that, because of course it is all our research is the labor of love. Just sort of through cheesy conclusion, but for me, given sort of some private issues that I had in my family, and then sort of Corona, I really, it was a way to kind of blind out, reality that was around you, and really just, work on it. It was a blessing in disguise in many ways. So, but it came out, of course, also during Corona, so I wasn't able to do major book talks or so. So I'm really appreciative of you to kind of, and again, I mean, there's a small audience. Sometimes I think like European studies are not all that interested in it, and for IR people, it's a little bit too EU focused. But I've made peace with it because I've always lived on the margins. I mean, that's what LGBT plus folks do, right? Yeah. And I love living on the margins.
It's there. Well,
it is there, exactly. It's just going to take a couple of years to realize.
Yeah. But now also EU scholars. I mean, I think that there is hope that some change will happen soon.
And I think there is an understanding that it has become crucial in European construction. That's also why I said, what is the role of those values? And the same with gender. So I think there is more interest that you can't have an EU research center without addressing those issues in one way or another.
But I don't know, in terms of LGBT values, the role of LGBTI rights for as European values, I'm not sure. Honestly, you can go much beyond what you and David put together.
No, the world changes. That is becoming old already. That was almost 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's my perspective.
No, I really appreciate that.
Also, for instance, all the criticism about, that I understand. I mean, about like the Western Balkans, and you were referring to Serbia Orthodox, and I think that this is really changing. I don't want to be, like too optimistic, because of course I'm aware of the reality, but in the last years we have had an explosion of pride parades. These are people who are risking sometimes their lives to participate to this parade.
Absolutely.
So this is also what Koen's book is. It shows many aspects also of this. But
he has tried recently. He tried to cancel the last Pride March.
Yeah, but exactly. You see the tensions between the political, then the social, the people, the resistance of activists and people. There are so many new layers that it's important to take into account, and also in terms of civil society activists and the internal oppositions that they do, and then you can look at, again, enlargement, LGBTIQ+, you know, as a negotiation tool. You know, you can expand in many different ways, but I think it's fascinating to look at what is going on among activists, you know, like this, really the perseverance of, you know, being there, being at the Pride, and really, you know, risk that their families afterwards can be, you know, really.
But I also have honestly I not the one, but you know, Pride itself is a problematic.
I agree, but
the whole Pride.
Yes,
type, you know,
but it's. I agree with you that it can be problematic, but in certain countries, this is the only channel that it exists now, you know, as a platform. So it can be problematic, but there are prides and prides. You know, different ones. You know, like
daily diverse pride.
I think that if you keep the context just.
We're losing folks here.
Just as because we are at 10 past 10.
Well, but thank you for all of your for the stimulating. I don't know. I love these discussions. Right, we don't have enough of that. And thank you for.
Thank you to all the online participants who are still there. Thank you.